and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about our work here at Traum Nutrition. And today I'm going to give some speech of about 40 minutes to give you some insight on our novel guideline around trace mineral supplementation. It is something we as a company should care a lot. We sell on a daily basis those minerals to customers. And one important aspect is to understand, okay, how much the cow actually need. So I jumped straight into the introduction of the topic. And when it comes to trace mineral, we know that there is a duality, and especially trace metal like copper, or iron, manganese, zinc can be are fundamental for animal physiology. And we know that a lack of those metals basically impair performance. You see here two sheep of equal age. One is lacking zinc in the diet, the other adequate zinc. Obviously, huge impact on performance. And we supplement those metals on a daily basis to avoid those catastrophic outcome in terms of health. At the same time, those metals like copper, especially, and iron, are highly reactive. And we know within the gut already that they have their reactivity and the interaction with the metal and the microorganisms can impair fiber degradability, can impair and interact with the enterocytes, and this can have detrimental effect on the health of the animal as well. So we want to avoid also those situations that we are overfeeding and creating a new problem. So hopefully we stay within the optimal health range, which is here in the middle. And because it's so important, trace metal have been very highly regulated by cattle. So you see here that the animal homeostasis is a key factor to make sure that the animal remain healthy all the way through the different supply. So today I'm going to discuss what mechanisms the cow basically use to maintain homeostasis. What are the key regulations that we should take into account when we think about trace mineral nutrition, but also the limitation. So that the limitations are key for us to understand in terms of how a minimal amount we should feed, but also how maximum amount we should not overfeed. And then based on this explanation of homeostasis, I will then give you an insight on what our thought about applying in practice these challenges and recommending for a proper supplementation rate. So when it comes to homeostasis, we are now discussing mainly zinc, copper, and manganese, and those elements are very much regulated in the gut. So you see here zinc coming in the diet, and this is the gut. Some of the zinc is coming from the body, so endogenously secreted into the gut, and then this is a factor of regulation. The animal can decide basically how much excretion you want to bring upon need, but most importantly, the true absorption is a key factor of regulation. So you see the amount of zinc which is both coming from endogenous and feed. The fraction that can be absorbed is highly variable. So the more we feed, the less is going to be absorbed. So basically the regulation happens in the gut, and urine play very little role in terms of urinary excretion quantitatively for trace metal regulation. If we look at zinc for a typical dairy cow, we see that with supplementation, a dairy cow will receive about 75 ppm zinc. Out of that, we looked at how it's coming out in a cow. So 62 ppm is coming out in feces, and the remaining 13 ppm is either exported into milk or retained in the body. This is for an average lactating cow. Now, this varies a lot because upon supply, and these are data in rats, that illustrate how true zinc absorption change according to zinc supply. And you see dietary zinc content on the x-axis and the true zinc absorption efficiency, the relative efficiency. So the less we feed, the more efficient basically the animal is, because this is so important for the animal to get sufficient zinc for animal physiology. So the absorption is simply increasing. And this is done because in the gut, there is specific transporters which are upregulated within the cell to uptake, but also metallothionein is going to be taking care of the cell integrity by binding zinc, and also the export of zinc towards blood. So it's regulated at 3 levels within the cell, and this makes the pattern of absorption efficiency we see here. The second aspect of regulation is that the animal tend to always absorb more than what it needs, and this is helping homeostasis to take place. So basically, when zinc supply increase, the animal absorbs a greater amount than what he needs, and then he exports it back into the gut as endogenous fecal secretion. And this part of this endogenous fecal secretion, endogenous secretion into the gut is going to end up in feces, and this will be a loss. And we typically consider that as a maintenance requirement, which we should cover. So in the end, when we looked at the absolute flux, this is the absorption of zinc in microgram per day, because here we are still discussing illustration of a rat, which are very well illustrative of the process quantitatively. You see the true absorption on the blue line, which is increasing with dietary zinc supply, and the apparent zinc retention. So the difference between the two lines are basically the amount of zinc which is absorbed, but it's returning into feces. And then the apparent zinc absorption, which is simply the exchange in zinc from the gut to the body, is actually matching net requirement across a wide range of dietary zinc. And this allows the animal to maintain homeostasis very well. But the consequence, of course, is that if we feed a diet which contains about 40 ppm or 140 ppm, naturally, there will be a lot more zinc in feces when we feed 140. So for the same outcome in terms of getting the zinc into the animal, then we basically multiply by 7.6 the amount of zinc that end up in feces. So that might have also some consequences in terms of environmental excretion. Now, some of the limits, and the limit that we tend to care about is really the lower limit, because of course, at some point, the available supply of zinc is going to be limited, and the animal is not able to meet his net requirement. So if you feed to this animal a diet which will only contain 20 ppm zinc, then you start to have issue because the animal has not the capacity to upregulate sufficient. The availability of zinc in the gut is not high enough. And then you see the consequences on body weight. So here, any of the 3 points below in the red range resulted to a loss in terms of not maintaining optimal body growth. And this, as nutritionists, is something we want to understand in terms of quantitatively for our cattle, growing cattle or lactating cattle. What is the potential for the cow to upregulate absorption, and how low can we go before we avoid, before we encounter this issue? So now, what's the current approach to feed formulation? We have here an example with an ASEM, and we typically, this is a factorial model where we sum up the different net requirements for zinc. Here we have fecal endogenous losses, gestation requirement growth, lactation. This gives us the net amount of zinc which is necessary for those processes. But then we have to take into account an absorption efficiency, and the absorption efficiency gives us how much zinc should we put in a diet as gross per kilogram diameter, for instance, to satisfy this net requirement. Now I highlighted in red two processes, the fecal endogenous loss and the true absorption, because this is the current limitation in our availability of data. We do not have a lot of data in cattle which quantifies those processes. And of course, we have to rely on assumption, and this is the best we could do, to so far rely on average number. But what is, how basically representative those numbers are to define the moment where the cow is at the maximum absorption efficiency? This is a big question, because these two fluxes are internal fluxes in the body that we cannot have very easily access to. Alternatively, we can look at trace metal intake and fecal excretion. And these two give us also the indication of if metal are moving into the body or if the metal is moving out of the body, basically the difference between the two fluxes. And this is what we will look at to try to define the lower limit in terms of zinc, manganese, and copper. So now if we looked at current feeding practices, and this is an example of two recent papers, well, one of them is more recent than the other, but you see the recommendation from in ppm for zinc, copper, and manganese in green, 11 ppm copper for lactating cows, 27 manganese, 56 zinc, and you see the current practices, which basically are slightly above those numbers, but not above the maximum tolerable level. So there is also a book version of the NRC which is about tolerance, and you basically see that for copper, for example, cattle are known to tolerate up to 40 ppm copper. We feed below this average, so in principle we should be fine with tolerance of this element. However, our group recently have also tried to study this more in a physiological point of view by characterizing how much, what's the regulation of copper, manganese, and zinc through the critical transition phase. And you see here a cow, so we have 12 cows in the metabolism unit. We follow them on a weekly basis from late lactation to early lactation, as you see the weekly dry matter intake. And the most interesting plot here is copper balance, because copper balance, we can basically monitor how much copper the animal eats and how much copper is exported into feces, how much copper is exported into milk and urine, and we come up with an estimation of copper balance. And we see that above a certain threshold, when dry matter intake increase for those high-producing lactating cow, we observe positive retention of copper. And this was an observation we also saw for zinc and manganese. And basically, it indicates that homeostasis was not playing its role. This is not a normal result when we looked at the data for rat. Because in principle, absorption efficiency plays a role, down-regulate, and once you account for all the net requirements, the accumulation of copper in the body should be null, it will be zero. So having a positive copper balance or positive manganese balance or positive zinc balance is something that was puzzling us. And when we looked at the observation in hepatic copper concentration across different geography, so UK, in the US, in the Netherlands, we all see that hepatic copper basically is quite high across this different area. And for about 10% of the cow, we have more than 1 gram of copper in the liver. And this is quite remarkable compared to other ruminants which are kept on the more extensive system where we can typically see 100 to 200 ppm copper. So copper is definitely accumulating in the liver, and this has sometimes been reported to have adverse effect in terms of health and fertility. There is a recent example from the UK which demonstrate this. So why does it happen? Because I show you that homeostasis is highly regulated, and the rat data show us very well, especially when we increase supply. Basically, when we increase supply above a certain concentration, then the concentration of this metal, and I illustrate here the example of zinc, is so high in the gut that although the regulated pathway is always down-regulated, so the absorption efficiency in this regulated pathway is at the lowest possible, so we are basically the maximum, so at the plateau on the curve. But there is always an unregulated flux, which basically is proportional to the supply, and which create a challenge for the animal because that animal has to process that additional zinc and get rid of that endogenously or else. And for copper, when we reflect about our modern dairy cow, this is a typical body weight and dry matter intake of growing heifers, mid-producing lactating cow, high-producing cow. We see body weight and the dry matter intake, most importantly, as a fraction of body weight. And we see as the cow produces more and more milk, those cows are consuming at a greater fraction of their body size. So when we feed the diet, which is the same for all those cattle, 15 ppm copper, naturally, those high-producing dairy cows are going to receive a large amount of copper in their daily intake. But if you look at net copper requirement does not vary much between those different categories of cattle. So basically, the dairy cow, when we express the copper intake relative to the net requirement, so minus net requirement, we see that that number for the same ppm in a diet increase for the lactating cow. And this is a risk factor because this put the dairy cattle at risk of not being able to downregulate sufficiently copper and accumulating copper in the liver, having potentially a detrimental effect on health. So now that I give you a first good introduction in terms of homeostasis of metal and the limitation on the lower side and the limitation that seems to apply to our dairy cattle, I would like to then give you some insight on how we as R&D have tried to basically take those processes into account so that we can better make recommendations for supplementation. And those recommendations are, there are few originality here. It's a quantitative definition of the lower and upper boundary where homeostasis work optimally. Then the quantification of probability density function. So what's the likelihood of a cow to receive a certain amount of copper or zinc or manganese when we do not supplement? What's the gross supply? What's the variability between farm, within farm? And what's the variability in terms of animal net requirement for those metal? And then we'll come, based on this basal understanding, how can we use that information to decide how much supplemental rate should we give. So coming back to the rat data, our idea to define the lower limit was to understand what maximum apparent zinc absorption efficiency is compatible with optimal health. And you see, I plotted here body weight trajectory and the apparent zinc absorption efficiency associated to this point. And you see that all the 3 points above the horizontal threshold were not compatible with optimal health because body weight was impaired. So our idea here, okay, those rats were able to have an apparent zinc absorption efficiency of about 65%, and this will be a reference for us to use in our as a lower limit. So what is this number for dairy cattle? And we went to the literature and we could find a study focused on copper, zinc, or manganese supply. And for copper, especially, we also find a lot of studies that play with the available copper supply by adding antagonists, either iron, molybdenum, sulfur. So all those studies had experimentally induced change in terms of the available supply of those metals. The study needed to have at least the basic reported dry matter intake performance, and they had to be of a minimum duration of 50 days. So we only took a longitudinal study, and we came up with 75 dietary treatment for copper, 34 for zinc, and 32 for manganese. Then we calculated, based on the understanding of how much copper, zinc, manganese you need for growth, for lactation, for gestation, the net requirement for all the study in the same method of calculation. And we looked at what will be the required apparent efficiency, because we know supply, we know how much copper is in the diet, and we know what's their net requirements. So the ratio between the two is the apparent absorption efficiency, which is required to make that a success for the cow. And we then confronted this calculation with the presence or absence of adverse effect reported in a publication. You see the example of copper, and this is a subset of study for copper which did not add antagonist. So they were just playing with copper supply, and there were no additional molybdenum, iron, or sulfur brought into the diet. And we saw that in 3 of those dietary treatments, basically, there were some reported health or growth or dry matter intake reduction. And we define a 10% safety margin where we say, okay, below 3.3% of copper apparent absorption efficiency, we expect, because it has not been described in the literature, that the cow will be able to cope and use homeostasis to manage and meet his net requirement from the diet. Above that, we say it's possible in some cases, but we enter a risk area because some adverse effects have been reported. But for copper, copper is highly influenced by other metals such as molybdenum, iron, sulfur. This is an example of the role of dietary molybdenum on copper absorption. And you see basically when we move from 1 to 5 ppm molybdenum, that we have the greatest effect on copper absorption efficiency, more or less a 50% reduction. So we also looked at the study which fed additional molybdenum, iron, or sulfur. And we see that here we have a greater number of data points which show adverse effect. So the maximum absorption efficiency potentially which is compatible for those animals when high molybdenum or high iron are in the diet is lower. And we need more conservative number which is here 1.9. We did the same exercise for zinc and manganese. So you see also as you feed less zinc and less manganese, so the greater absorption efficiency the cow needs to acquire sufficient zinc for the net requirement. And we were able to find in the literature some example and illustration of adverse effects for reduction of milk zinc content, or especially for manganese abnormality for gestating cows which were holding a calf at birth. And we took those publications into consideration to define the threshold. And we have now apparent absorption efficiency, which we can use to define our lower limits. To say, okay, if absorption efficiency on the diet need to be above the threshold, we will say it's risky and supplementation is definitely advised. So now that we have covered the first part of the curve in terms of what minimal levels the cow should is capable of upregulated, we also were interested to come up with estimation quantitatively of the higher upper boundary. Because this is the observed balance minus the expectation. And in normal cases for homeostasis, then you expect that number to be 0. This is when homeostasis is working perfectly. But we saw, especially for copper, that copper can accumulate in the liver, that after a while, especially copper can raise to substantial levels, and we were aiming to find upper limit of regulation. So our recent study, where we follow those cows through the transition period, we use that data, and this is the data of individual data point, weekly data point. And you see in green the dry period observation, in black the late lactation, and in red the early lactation. And basically above a certain threshold, we see at first the relationship between supply and the observed copper balance relative to the expectation match our expectation. We have a straight line, horizontal line at 0. But above a certain levels, then there seems to be a greater likelihood of accumulation. And we basically quantify that by taking the data on the right and do regression accounting for the cow effect, and basically use the intercept where the curve crosses at 0 as a first quantitative reference to define our upper limit. And this limit was defined in terms of supply relative to body weight. So milligram per day that the cow can eat relative to body weight. And this threshold have been further substantiated with some additional study we did at our farms, where we had growing steers fed incremental level of copper. And this is copper balance on the left and urinary copper excretion on the right. And you see that the gross dietary copper supply above net requirement. And I plotted the vertical line, which is our upper limit, which we defined from the previous study. And we see that this data seems to support and justify an upper limit, because above a certain levels, we see significant increase of urinary copper excretion, which may be indicative of excessive metabolic availability of copper within the body. And this, knowing the reactivity of those metals, seems to be something we should be prevented. So the other substantiation in the literature for our upper limit come from study, especially in growing steers, where steers were slaughtered, and access to the livers, or some of those are biopsy also. And you see the daily fluctuation of hepatic copper based on the supply of copper. And within the range of supply when copper is very narrow, the change in the hepatic copper seems to be very moderate. But when we go above a certain level, then cows tend to accumulate a lot of copper. And our limit here is again matching quite well with this data set. For zinc and manganese, we also found upper limit, and we were surprised. For copper, we were not surprised to find that there is an upper limit, because I think all of you are now aware that we should be cautious with copper supplementation. But for zinc and manganese, we also demonstrated that both the balance and the urinary excretion of zinc and manganese increase above the threshold that we had defined in our dairy study. And you see, particularly relevant is to find quantitative increase, although it's small, but urine excretion of metal is not a normal thing to happen. So when metals like zinc and manganese are increased in urine, in human, it's particularly a bad sign. And I think it's something that we would like to prevent. So now that we have an idea of upper and lower limits, the question is, where our dairy cattle in terms of their supply without supplementation stand. So if we were to make a distribution of the dairy cattle we feed, where are they? What are the risks for them to be deficient? And what are the risks for them to be exceeding their tolerable level? So for that, we first wanted to model typical formulation variability in dairy diet. And this, I'm going to give the example of lactating dairy cow. So we use a first exercise from the literature, and this is rather old reference, but which was extensive analysis of forages in North America. And you see the average copper of grass, corn, and reconstituted concentrate, taking into account the variability in feed formulation of concentrate. And you see the average and standard deviation. So most importantly, looking at the standard deviation. What's the likelihood to have a low basal dietary copper in your diet, very low zinc or manganese? So we take this variability into account and then simulated what will be the variability of incorporation of those elements. So we took meta-analysis to tell us what's the average and standard deviation of concentrate inclusion in lactating cow. And this is, again, representative more of perhaps North American diet, because this is the most represented type of study in this meta-analysis. And then the remaining of the diet were allowed to be anything between 0 and 100% grass, or anything between 0 and 100% corn, just to model variability. So with that, we are able to then establish a histogram, normal distribution of what will be the typical dietary copper variability, taking into account this variation in concentration in feedstuff and variation in feed formulation. And you see here the median, but most importantly, what are the lowest and highest that we may be exposed. And I give the example here in copper and zinc. The next modeling exercise was to model what type of animal are we feeding. So what typically dry matter intake or milk yield do we see? And here we took data from a meta-analysis published by Hussein and Santos in 2019, where we simulated a data set that will contain 30% of cremiparous and 70% multiparous, and use the average and standard deviation of that meta-analysis to generate the typical distribution here. So when we take these two factors into account, the dietary variability and the animal variability, we can estimate the variability in copper, zinc, and manganese supply. On the left, you see copper supply. So it's simply dry matter intake multiplied by the dietary concentration of copper. And on the right, you see the net copper requirement, taking into account the need for lactation, growth, and gestation. And the ratio between the two, so the net copper requirement divided by the gross dietary copper supply, is the apparent copper absorption. And the apparent copper absorption, we have now defined a lower limit. What is the maximum ability of the cow to upregulate? So we can contrast that and see what's the fraction of cattle below our lower limit and at risk of deficiency. The same, we have now defined upper limit in terms of gross supply minus net requirement. So we can also define what's the likelihood of this population to be at risk of exceeding their tolerance. So for the lower side, the probability here, conservative probability, because at first this does not take into account the role of molybdenum, sulfur, and iron, because we have two thresholds for the situation, and an equation basically that define that exact ratio. But you see, under normal circumstances, when molybdenum is not a key issue, that about 6% of the cow are at high risk of copper deficiency, and the remaining of the population will be apparently fine with the basal diet. The same for exceeding the potential tolerance. We see here that already with the basal diet, some cattle are already at risk of exceeding their copper tolerance because dietary copper, together with the high dry matter intake of those cattle, makes some of those cows sensitive and potentially at risk of exceeding their tolerance. So the question, when we have the ability to define for different geography and contexts, those probability, of course, this is an example of the literature. When we can go into local contexts, it's even more interesting. But it gives us information that we typically don't talk. What's the risk of deficiency? Quantifying this risk and quantifying the risk of exceeding tolerance. So the challenge now is to minimize this risk with supplementation. And you can definitely see that with supplementation, we are going to minimize the risk of deficiency, but we may expose some cattle to increasing risk of toxicity. So what are the range that minimize basically the population and to remain in the optimal range healthy? So we have that basal diet here, and we just want to find out how much copper, how much zinc, manganese should I put in my diets to bring that distribution to the sweet spot. And for that, we decided to leave 1% of the total population under a risk for optimization purposes here, because we were aiming to feed one single premix to this whole population. And what composition of premix for that single premix will be able to minimize the risk of being below 1%. So less than 1% of the cow at risk of deficiency, and less than 5% of the cow at risk of exceeding tolerance. And our choice of imbalance between 1% and 5% is justified because the threshold of deficiency was quantified with data set where actual observation of decreased growth or decreased dry matter intake were observed. While the upper limit is more a physiological concept, and we do not have data sets yet to indicate that when exceeding this upper limit, immediate adverse effects are going to occur. So then we gave more flexibility to exceed that upper limit to 5%. And for copper, those are the numbers basically that match this condition in diets that do not contain high amount of molybdenum or sulfur. So typical average diet. And you see that the range between lower and upper limit are very different depending on the cattle category we are discussing. And lactating cow in particular, the range is very narrow. And this is because, again, dry matter intake is so high in those animals, and the net copper requirement is very tiny. So a little excess of supplementation can very rapidly lead to an accumulation of copper in the liver. So you see that depending on which category of animals we are discussing, and this is numbers then converted in ppm, the risk is different. And for a dry cow, there is a lot more room before we reach to that potential level of exceeding tolerance. And you also see with this table that there is justification for supplementation of copper to minimize the risk of deficiency. So very quickly, we have number also that deal with specific conditions such as high risk of high level of molybdenum, 3, 4, 5 ppm in the overall diet. And you see that then that lower limit is sometimes higher than the upper limit, which means that in those specific cases, we have to look at case by case, and that a single premix cannot be made to blanket and avoid and feed to all those animals, because then we will be exposing others to high risk of toxicity. For zinc, there is definitely evidence that zinc supplementation is beneficial across the different age category, especially lactating cows, which are highly producing. There is about 4.5 ppm zinc in milk, but we also see that the upper limit is quite high, so there is room for homeostasis to occur in those animals. Interestingly, when we take into account the available data that show issue with manganese deficiency, we see that during lactating cows and even dry cows, so cows which are going to calve for a second time or more, that apparently no manganese supplementation is still going to be okay for those cows to maintain manganese homeostasis. This is after having taken into account all the issues which have been described in the literature and related to manganese homeostasis. So we also try to take a more concrete example from practical application by going with our colleagues from Quebec and looking at what are their actual variability in feed formulation. So this is not simulation anymore, but this is actual feed formulation from cows in Quebec. You see the variability in corn, grass, and concentrate in this area, and the variability for copper in corn and grass. And you see that variability is quite large. And we did the exercise also with our own farm. So this is our experimental farms looking at the variability historically in the forage in the Netherlands for corn and grass. And here we are looking at a very specific context. It's just one farm, and the other is one region. And we try to see, the recommendation that we were displaying for the lactating dairy cow using the literature data set, how does it apply to these two specific case? So now I have for copper, zinc, and manganese, the lactating cow recommendation in terms of ppm, and you see the number that I show you on the literature data. The example of a farm in Quebec where we had 1,250 farms, and you see the lower and upper limits for all those scenarios, including our own experimental farm, Kempensof, in the Netherlands. And basically, you see there is quite good agreement between the lower and upper range. And typically, if I look at this, we could define a premix specification that will meet mostly the need of those cows, while minimizing the deficiency area and minimizing the exceeding tolerance of those cattle. 3 ppm copper, 43 ppm zinc, 10 ppm manganese will, in that case, be compatible with optimum health. So when we looked at current situation, it seems that based on our current practices, there may be benefits to lower supplementation rate, so that the distribution is going to be mostly within the sweet spot area. And something that I've not talked to, but other speakers are going to give a lot more information about this, is that trace mineral quality also matter in that respect. And supply is a very important effect because supply is a dominant factor in terms of trace mineral nutrition, but the quality of trace metal also influence, especially the tail of this distribution. We know that a high quality bioavailable mineral source really matter when we are feeding a low amount for preventing deficiency. If we are supplying 2 times the amount that the animal need, then bioavailability does not matter a lot. But when we supply excessive amount, then the reactivity of the metals is also very important, as it can impair fermentation in the rumen, it can impair reaction with enterocyte, and there is plenty of literature on that aspect. So mainly, the quality source of minerals help for those tails to remain in the optimal range. So just a take-home message that we observe unregulated trace metal retention in cattle, and it seems to be a biological anomaly, because this is typically something which do not occur in monogastric, or it's really a lot more regulated at high supply to see in cattle. Supplementation guidelines should consider the opportunity of upregulation. Cattle have a big role to play in terms of upregulating and making sure that they also get sufficient amount. So we should trust and use that as an opportunity in our feed formulation. But we should also consider the risk of exceeding downregulation competence of those animals, which seems to be especially prevailing in high-producing cattle consuming large amount of feed. So the novel guideline that we bring forward confirm the value of supplementation, but also expose the risk of excessive tolerance. So when we discuss adequate trace metal nutrition, we need an accurate definition of supplementation rate, but also the form of supplementation that allow to support best homeostasis. And with that, I would like to end and give the floor back to Javier.
Quite a bit of information. I think you agree with me that there was a lot to digest in this presentation, so I expect many questions. Anyone? It was so clear.
I don't know. Yes.
Hi. My practical question will be, can we assess, because you mentioned in the slide that the homeostasis is done mainly via feces route. So what is excess usually is excreted via feces. My question will be, can we do this kind of assessment on farm level to understand what is the mineral status of a herd, for example?
Yeah, it's not that to apply this readily in the farm. Of course, it's possible, but I expect that it's going to be leading to a lot of error when we try to estimate apparent absorption on the farm, because already experimentally it's not an easy measurement to be done, and the numbers are very variable. That I think this will not work to look at feces and give an estimation of stature. But in the end, feces is going to be very proportional to the supply. So having a close look at how much do we supplement, what's the typical dramator intake of those animals, I think is a more reasonable numbers to look at, and to contrast with our new upper and lower limits to evaluate, are we within the range? And then, of course, blood samplings can tell us if there is extreme. Blood sampling is only mainly helpful to detect very clinical deficiency when the animals are already, not subclinical deficiency, when we are really low supply. And the liver also tell us some information. But I think already looking at the diet on papers in relation to this number is already a first good step.